Right. Morning, guys. Hope you all well. Welcome to Help Desk for this particular semester. Just a very basic module, really. Just looking at the whole concept of the service desk as far as the ICT industry is concerned. I'm sure most of you are familiar with most of the content that we'll be discussing. Possibly, obviously, most are in this industry already. So it's just a concept of just understanding exactly how to successfully provide a service desk in both internal and external environments, as far as the entirety of the ICT industry there is concerned. So what we're going to be looking at ultimately is naturally what the whole overview of the module is all about, looking at your assessments and the resources that are necessary to ensure that obviously you get the right acumen as far as the actual module is concerned. Um, um, as well as also looking at just the basic introductory part in terms of what the whole concept of service desk environments are all about in that regard. So the actual module, like we mentioned before, you've got about five module outcomes, and arguably the whole concept of it is just looking at the service desk as an actual profession. What are the actual processes, procedures, and technologies that are used as far as these particular service desk environments are concerned, and just obviously providing some kind of basic or foundational knowledge in terms of the roles and responsibilities of individuals that are obviously involved within the whole concept of the service desk environment. So the first module outcome is just looking at operational procedures within the ICT space. Second one, looking at understanding what the roles and responsibilities of these particular service desk personnel are all about within that same ICT environment. Also understanding some of the technologies and tools that are used. I think it's imperative to understand that it's not just a question of ensuring that you provide an appropriate service desk environment from a professional point of view or from a people point of view, but also understanding exactly what type of technologies can be put in place to ensure that everything runs smoothly and obviously without much precedent in that regard. Then what measures can be put in place to ensure that you're providing this service desk accordingly, and what kind of benchmarks are there to literally judge your particular performance in that industry, and then also looking at what particular habits provide for a good workplace in that environment, and lastly the whole concept of customer support as an actual profession as far as the ICT space there is concerned. Now you've got your generic ICE incorporated there, so you'll still have that 10% component. And remember, like I've said before, when we were looking at computer architecture last semester, is that naturally to ensure that you literally get a better mark associated with your ICE. It's imperative that any particular research or task that I do dish out would be ICE related. Obviously, the more tasks that you undertake, the better in terms of totalizing as far as that ICE mark is concerned. And you'll also discover that as part and parcel of the actual assessment at large, you will need to look at a specific report, obviously pulling out those four distinctive tasks that you literally found engaging, that were relevant in terms of you understanding module content, have a generic report drawn up, and then also plug that in as part and parcel of your POE. So this is literally not an exam-based module. It's a POE-based module, which obviously means that you're submitting an actual document towards the end of the actual semester itself. It naturally will constitute 35% of your overall mark as far as the actual module rather is concerned. So you'll discover that with the generic pass mark, like we mentioned before, is obviously going to be 50. should you be sitting between 40 and 48%, then naturally what that means is you qualify for a supplementary or a resubmission of that particular module or POE. And then naturally what that would mean, because it's a resubmission, you'll naturally be kept at 50% in that regard. But we'll obviously look at it in a positive sense and make sure that we ace the actual submission as far as content there would go. So you've got your ICE, 4 minimum tasks, and remember, minimum doesn't mean the only task that you'll do. And then you've got the 35% component associated with your distinctive POE at large. So you'll have 2 tasks that will be due. I'm not so sure if your PAS is out yet. If it is, then naturally those dates have already been indicated in terms of when they're due. If not, it should be plugged in about a couple of days or so. I think it's also important to understand that these dates just give you enough time to plan. So try and avoid submitting on the actual due dates as far as these particular tasks or assignments are concerned. At least about a week or so before makes it a lot easier. And at the same time, remember, normally you'll find that you'll need to generate a safe assign report with your submissions as well. So if you're all submitting at the same time, sometimes you could find system glitches, bottlenecks, obviously, and then that would create delays in these safe assigned reports being generated. And unfortunately, your assessments will not be marked if these safe assigned reports are not part and parcel of your submission. So just ensure that at least a couple of days before, I normally advocate for a week or so. Naturally, why? Because like I said before, you already have these dates at hand. It's easier for you to plan, and makes it a lot easier also for you to tackle specific sections of the assessment as you go along. So instead of having to do it all at the same time, a night or so before the actual assignment is due, to avoid any discrepancies in that regard. So you've got 2 tasks that will literally be in line with your assignment. So the task 1 and task 2 is literally your assignment 1 and assignment 2 associated with the module at large. 25% weighting for task 1 and 30% weighting for task 2. Naturally, all open book, but again, like I've mentioned before, I think it's imperative to look at the different sections accordingly as we obviously conclude them, and try and complete those particular sections in time, or literally beforehand, for better management as far as the whole issue of content and time there is concerned. So you've got task 1 and task 2, assignment 1, assignment 2 associated with this particular module at large. We'll obviously be discussing these towards the actual due dates. I think possibly within a 2-week period before they are due, so that at least we know exactly what we need to take into consideration when we are gathering information and naturally plugging information for this particular assessment. So we've got about 8 learning units for the actual module itself, and that would directly link to the chapters associated with the actual prescribed textbook. So you've got about 8 chapters as well in that prescribed textbook. So each particular chapter is literally each particular learning unit as far as module content would go. So for task 1, that's learning units 1 to 3 that would be covered, which is literally chapters 1 to 3. And then your task 2 would be learning units 4 to 6, which literally again would be chapters 4 to 6 as far as your prescribed content there is concerned. Like I've mentioned before, I do advocate for you to probably pop me a mail with drafts if need be, for pointers where you might need to recalibrate your assignment or your assessment or your submission there in order for you to at least try and get better marks in total. And obviously try and submit these a couple of days or weeks before as well. Try and avoid popping me a mail with a draft the actual night before. Unfortunately, in that regard, it will be very difficult for me to assist you accordingly. there. All right, so and then resources, so that's your textbook. But remember, with all your modules, literally the prescribed textbook is not the only, or prescribed material per se is not the only source of content, right? So it's just typically indicating that it's the main source of content associated with the actual module at large. But ultimately, you also have other sources that will enable you to understand content a little bit better, and naturally make it a lot easier for you as far as just getting the appropriate understanding from the actual module at large. So you're going to be looking at a guide to service desk concepts, the 4th edition, and the author there is Donna Knapp. That's the prescribed textbook, or the main material that you need to be looking at. But you also have other recommended readings, both digital and literally web sources that you'll find in that regard. So you also have Computer Confluence, as well as the complete PC upgrade and maintenance guide as some of the other material that you can also use to literally better your understanding in terms of what's happening with the whole concept of service desk environments. So Donna Knapp, 2014 edition, a guide to service desk concepts, the 4th edition specifically, and the other prescribed materials that you find as far as that particular screen or slide there is concerned. Right. So as far as the learning unit 1 is concerned, remember we mentioned that you've got about 8 learning units. What we're going to be concentrating on today is the first learning unit, just naturally looking at the whole idea of what a service desk are all about. So basic introduction to your service desk concepts as far as material would go. So what you're actually looking at is the themes at large there. So the first theme, looking at service desk, from help desk to service desk, explaining obviously the increasing demand for end user support within the ICT space, also identifying the actual evolution of technical support as far as your environments are concerned, also looking at the actual role of this particular service desk in technical support. Second theme is looking at the different components of a service desk and obviously the associated skills that are relevant in that regard. What are the actual components that provide for an actual successful service desk, looking at the actual skills that are required in order for you to actually work at a distinctive service desk. And then the last part there, just obviously looking at why customer service is the bottom line of a service desk environment. I think it's imperative to understand that the moment you work at the moment you provide a service desk, you obviously will have a massive engagement with your clients or customers, both external and internal, as far as your organizations are concerned. That interaction, what does it do in terms of the image of your organization, in terms of the image of the environment, and what does it actually do for the business at large? Remember, you've got positive, negative ratings. How do these affect your particular output at the end of the day in terms of from an economic point of view, as far as the whole setup there is concerned? So first chapter is what we're looking at, like I mentioned before, introduction to the whole concept of what's happening with your generic service desks. Again, just with that particular breakdown we saw a couple of seconds ago, just making sure we are all on the same page in that regard. So once again, Guide to Service Desk Concepts, the 4th edition is what you're looking at in terms of actual module content as far as prescribed material there is concerned. So what are the objectives actually as far as this particular chapter is concerned? More or less what we discussed in the actual breakdown of the learning unit at large, the evolution rather of your technical support, looking at what's happening within the service desk as far as your technical support department environments are concerned, that whole concept of the components of a successful service desk. And then lastly, that bottom line we're just discussing a couple of seconds ago, why it's relevant, and obviously how it affects the whole concept of you providing the appropriate service desk environment in that regard. Now, when you look at the whole concept of the service desk, ultimately you are trying to provide a basic point of contact within a specific institution organization that looks at managing customer incidents and service requests. So remember, an incident is more or less an actual you could say temporary issue associated with ICT service in any given space. And literally what you want to provide for is a platform or an area or an environment that clients or customers can literally contact, obviously a single point of contact, and get these particular incidents or issues resolved accordingly to avoid any discrepancies. Remember, the whole concept is to ensure that your particular clientele get a smooth functioning of whatever product or service that you're providing for. So obviously from a technological point of view, you also want to ensure that they encounter minimal issues associated with your setup. So a basic incident is just distinctively an unplanned interruption in your IT service or reduction of the quality of the IT service that you're looking at. So if you're looking at internet connectivity as a typical example, it's that unplanned drop in speed as far as connectivity would go, or that unplanned outage of connectivity in its entirety. That's what a basic incident is all about in that regard. So what you're typically looking at from a technological point of view is technological dependence obviously results in basic enormous challenge across the board. That's the reason why that service desk becomes ultimately important. So obviously the demand for support plus and naturally the shortage of ICT professionals obviously looks at a tremendous career opportunity in the field that deals with customer service environments at large. And I think it's also important to understand that with a massive evolution in terms of technology at large, you will also discover that you have certain environments that provide for self-service in that regard, that individuals might not actually need to call in to a distinctive central desk for them to get certain issues resolved, because you've got the whole concept of self-service environments provided for, with that whole issue of technology advancing as far as environments would go. So I think you might have all experienced this in your own personal and professional capacities as well, that instead of having to call in to have certain issues resolved, some of these issues can be resolved by yourselves without having to call in, obviously with the advent of these self-service environments, either using your instant messaging platforms or basic web chat environments dependent on configurations at large. Now, when you look at the whole concept of the evolution of technical support, it's important to understand where it started and literally where it's going and where it's at, in order for you to ensure that you understand exactly when you're providing this particular support, what you're actually looking at as far as configurations would go. So remember, all the way back when these particular machines were initially designed in the 60s, and then naturally in your early 70s, you had obviously little support. And more often than not, the developers of certain products or architectures were the ones that were responsible for providing that support. So it made it a lot difficult for them to work with the actual product or technical aspect, and then also provide distinctive support for that specific product or technology, if you want to look at it from a different point of view. And then naturally, when you look at the whole issue of the graduation all the way up until current environments, you obviously find that the need is great. Users naturally demand options, and service desks have literally become a bit more proactive. So when you look at the whole concept of technical support. Again, like we were mentioning before, just a wide range of services that literally enable individuals and organizations to literally look at the effective use of ICT at large. And it provides for what they call part and parcel of the total cost of ownership when it comes to technology. And what this particularly means is when you look at buying a specific technology or buying a specific product within that ICT space, it doesn't end at you just buying that product as far as, or technology as far as usage would go. You were looking at the cost of maintenance, the cost of so if you give, let's give an example of a laptop for argument's sake. You walk into a store, you buy a laptop. Normally, these particular laptops would come with your operating systems pre-installed, right? And then, as far as that particular laptop is concerned, you purchasing it doesn't end there. Or literally, you using some kind of economic aspect to buy that particular product doesn't end there, because you now need to install your application packages in order for you to use your machine for a specific purpose. You now need to also install anti-malware softwares as far as that particular machine there goes. You will also now need to probably subscribe to an internet service in order for you to use that particular gadget over the network. You might need to upgrade it over time, probably install more RAM, or upgrade your particular drive to an SSD if it wasn't an SSD before. If it was, then probably want to get a much larger capacity, a hard drive for argument's sake. So those are all examples of total cost of ownership. You might also end up having to possibly buy wireless mice as far as usage there would go. At the same time, you might also need to buy a set of headsets if you're going to be participating on the online platform in terms of either gaming or participating in virtual meetings, just for argument's sake. So this is a typical example of products and architectures that you might need to buy additional to the actual laptop at large. So for argument's sake, that laptop cost 5K. It doesn't stop there, because you now need to buy application packages. So if you're going to go with a Microsoft Office suite, just for argument's sake, let's assume that you're buying professional plus, for argument's sake, you're adding possibly another 2K there as far as content would go. And then you might need to also buy an antiviral package. Probably that's another $500 that will set you back. And then you might need to buy a set of good headsets associated with your usage there. Possibly that's another 1,500 as far as your setup would go. Then with the upgrades, the list will go on and on. So that's what the total cost of ownership is all about when it comes to technology at large. So when you look at customer support, basic services, obviously, that help your clients literally understand and benefit from the product's capabilities, right? So that's what your customer support is all about. So there's a massive difference between, obviously, technical support and customer support. So when you're looking at technical support, ultimately, you're looking at the effective use of your technology at large. But on the other hand, when you look at customer support, you're now looking at your clients literally understanding or looking at the benefits of the actual product or technology in terms of capabilities, by literally answering questions that enable them to solve problems and provide some kind of training in terms of using that distinctive product as far as configurations would go. So you'll find that your customers would obviously buy products and services. Users consume these particular products and services as far as your service desk environment is concerned. So like I was mentioning earlier on, with the evolution of this particular technical support, from a diagrammatic representation there, back in the 70s, there, as a typical example, there was little support provided for in that regard, because like I was mentioning earlier on, it wasn't literally an industry or a career point at that particular point in time. That's the reason why you'd find that the developers of the actual software or systems at large would also be the ones that will be responsible for providing a distinctive service. And then after some time, certain organizations would obviously identify that there's a natural need in terms of providing this particular support at large. So different numbers for the actual hardware and software at large. Companies would obviously needed to set up these particular information centers, and your IBM was responsible for literally creating that term, if you want to look at it from a different point of view, within the ICT environment, which is generically your help desk. And then your users were later viewed as customers. So naturally, with the growth of technology in that regard, most institutions literally focused on customer support, and obviously had to set up a formal help desk environments which would assist their clientele. So remember that help desk would be that single point of contact within any particular company for technology-related questions and incidents. That's generically what your help desk is all about in that regard. Just a single point of contact within any particular institution, organization, for technically related questions or incidents that might arise in that regard. And then with that continuation there, technical support was now viewed as something a bit more critical. Again, with the advancement of techno, with the advancement of distinctive users as well, if you want to look at it from a different point of view, you now had the need for that particular support to be identified as something critical within any particular institution. So the internet space became commercialized, and naturally you find that computer systems were used across every particular industry as far as your environments there would go. And then obviously technology used at any time and within any particular environment. So your mobile computing, cloud computing, and obviously the BYOD that we mentioned again in computer architecture before. You bring your own device for configuration and usage within your organization's platform, and obviously the service desk enabling that self-help I was talking about earlier on to make it a lot easier for the service desk as well as the customers and clientele at large. Like I was mentioning earlier on, I think kind of spreads the work across. A typical example of this would be DSTV, for argument's sake. I think there was a point in time a couple of years ago where you'd literally need to call in for every distinctive issue that you're encountering. So connectivity issues, you are not being able to view certain channels, just for argument's sake, that are on your package, you are distinctively having to call in for you to upgrade your particular package or downgrade your particular package or confirm that payment has been received. The list will go on and on in terms of the kind of issues that we experience in that regard. But if you look at your DSTV platforms now, there's a whole host of issues that can be resolved using self-help platforms, right? So if you not able to connect, for argument's sake, or if you're having intermittent connectivity, there's an error code that actually pops up, and there's a whole list of you could say a specific guide, if you want to look at it from a different point of view, that would then list each one of these errors, specify what a specific error is all about, and also enable you to resolve that error using self-help platforms that have been designed. So you might not actually need to actually call in if you're having connectivity issues. It could be a weather problem, it could be a technical glitch from their side, or it could be an issue that you for argument's sake, might not have paid for your subscription. The list will go on and on. So there's so many things now from a DSTV platform that you don't need to call in to get resolved, but you can solve them on your own. So even if it's a payment issue, log into your DSTV platform online, make the payment, ensure that connectivity is restored at a specific time, specific date, if need be. Same difference would go with the upgrades and the downgrades. You can actually set on your online platforms there when you want to upgrade your package, when you want to downgrade that package, and obviously the specific dates and time in that regard. Obviously, that's part and parcel of the whole concept of your self-help. And what that would do also is it makes it a lot easier for that central service desk at the DSTV environment, as a typical example, to focus on more technical problems, or more critical issues, just for argument's sake. So there's already an indication to a certain extent that if someone does actually call in, probably it's an issue that literally needs attention, or some more critical problem associated with connectivity, with usage of their product or service, just for argument's sake. Yes, you'll still have certain individuals that will still prefer to speak to a human being to have their issues resolved. But obviously that particular number has distinctively dropped, because you've got the WhatsApp platforms that are there, you've got the web chat environments that are there, you've got the internet space where you can actually log into your own profile and sort your own issues in that regard. So that's a typical example of that particular evolution we're talking about in terms of the whole issue of the technical support environment. And then obviously looking at a massive need where obviously users now have different options or demands, right? As far as your setups they are concerned. And obviously that particular service desk environment becoming more of a proactive platform as opposed to reactive. So making sure that you anticipate certain problems that might arise and provide for solutions beforehand, so that when these particular issues are literally identified and experienced, then ultimately what's happening in this regard is that you've got more proactive environments as far as your particular setups there are concerned. So that's the generic evolution of your service desk or help desk at large. And obviously the whole concept of consumerization of IT, where your customers' preferences drive the actual adoption of technology in the workplace at large. And like I was mentioning earlier on, with your BYOD environment, you bring your own device. Setup involves obviously using personally owned mobile devices or personally owned laptops, or to even a certain extent your desktop environments, to access business applications in that regard. So it makes it a lot easier in terms of you using a device that you're already familiar with. So in essence, if you get a company or institution deployed laptops or gadgets or devices, sometimes it could be a bit cumbersome for you to actually get familiar with that device, right? So let's just, for argument's sake, you're used to Android, you get an Apple or iOS phone, or vice versa. The whole issue is, yes, the underlying architectures are one and the same, but it might take you some time to get familiar and comfortable with that gadget or device. Same difference would go with the actual laptops that could be company deployed as well. So ultimately, if you end up using your own personal gadget, you've used this gadget for a while, you're familiar with it, it's more or less very personal, if you want to look at it from a different point of view, makes it a lot easier for that seamless transmission or seamless transition rather from your personal setup to your professional environment in that regard. That's why BYOD there, or bring your own device, becomes quite relevant. Obviously, we'll discuss some of the discrepancies experienced in that regard. For instance, what we're mentioning, in obviously a security issue, that if that personal laptop or that personal phone, for instance, gets compromised or stolen or lost, if you look at it from a different point of view, then from a security point of view, when it comes to your organization, that could be a bit detrimental in that regard. But it's still part and parcel of the whole concept of that evolution we're talking about in terms of the ICT space in that regard. So one of the other things as well that you're looking at is certain technologies, certain documentation that were also adopted to enable some kind of uniformity across the board. Remember, what you want to look at is you want these particular service desk platforms, especially within the ICT space, to have some kind of uniformity, which makes it a lot easier for you to look at deployment to your clients or customers, regardless of whatever product or service that you're distinctively providing for. So there was the ITIL, which is short for your IT infrastructure library, that was distinctively created back in the 90s there, which is just basically a set of best practices for IT service management in that regard. So it's more or less like, if you want to look at it from a different point of view, more of a manual or a guide that is distinctively used in that setup. So obviously with your best practice, just looking at something that has been tried and tested in terms of completing an actual task to produce always near optimum, not distinctively optimum results, because we've mentioned before that it can never be 100% in terms of providing these particular services, but you can actually push towards that distinctive figure there. So something that's proven over time in terms of experience and research, and naturally something that works for a large number and variety of individuals and institutions at large in that regard. And then you also have the ITSM, which is literally looking at focusing on the actual quality and then the relationship between the provider and the customer. I think there's another aspect as well that you need to take into consideration here. It's not always just about quality of the product or the service, but the engagement or the relationship between the actual organizations that provide these products and services with their customers, because there's always a misconception in terms of providing the best service and forgetting that there still needs to be some kind of relationship between the customer and the clients. More often than not, you get a lot of individuals that would mention that, okay, look, I've gotten one of the best products or services from a specific institution or company or organization, but their customer service or their engagement with customers is really rubbish. So it's important to understand that there has to be a balance between the actual quality provided, service or product related, as well as the actual way in which that product or service is provided for, as far as your clientele setup there is concerned. I think most of us, if not all, have experienced this before, that you get really quality products or services from specific institutions, but the way in which they engage with you, or the way in which they look at providing or after sales support, if you want to look at it from a different point of view, becomes really null and void in that aspect. And those things determine whether your clientele grows or diminishes. I think there's always that misconception that as long as I provide for a good service, or as long as I've got a good product, I'm good to go. But if you don't realize that interaction between yourselves and the actual clients is imperative and important, there's always an issue. I think we've also had issues where you are treated so brilliantly, but the products are also, or services are rubbish. And sometimes you appreciate the way in which these particular institutions, organizations, or individuals interact with you in terms of the literally part and parcel of the whole concept of providing an actual relationship in that regard. So there has to be a balance between maybe if we say it in a different way, one cannot literally exist without the other, right? It's imperative that these particular issues or these particular platforms are massively interrelated. There's no way that you can provide quality services without providing a proper relationship between you as the providers and the customers at large. And at the same time, there's no way that you can provide for a proper relationship between yourselves as the providers and the customers without providing quality services at large. And when you're looking at basic definitions in that regard, obviously the service value to actual customers at large there, obviously without ownership of specific costs and risk at large, right? It's still, again, all about providing a balance in that regard, because you're in that business obviously for a positive economic outcome at the end of the day. So again, looking at proper identification of some of the costs that might arise and risk in that regard. And then obviously the IT service is all based on the ICT space. And massively, what you're looking at there is supporting business processes as far as your specific environments would go. So identify what an actual service is all about. Service is looking at value, and then your IT service at large there is looking at ICT supporting business processes within your environments. So we discussed what an incident is right at the beginning there. Like I mentioned before, just something that is obviously unplanned. Because the moment it becomes planned, you can focus in terms of alternatives that can be undertaken in that regard. So when an incident arises, you need to call in, or you need to find out exactly what issue has arisen there, and naturally something that's unplanned in terms of an actual interruption in its entirety, so stoppage of an IT service, for argument's sake, or ultimately a reduction in the actual quality of that particular service. I think earlier on we used internet connectivity as a typical example, where it's cut off completely. You need to find out exactly what's happening in that regard, or ultimately the actual speed becomes quite unbearable. You also still need to find out what's happening. So that's obviously the reduction in the quality if you're looking at that particular setup there. So obviously beforehand, these were known as issues or problems. But naturally, you'll find that library that we were talking about earlier on literally defines that distinctive problem as one or more incidents in that regard. And then ultimately, your service request is something from your user looking at basic information or advice in that regard. So when you look at the service desk in a broader point of view, you are looking at a scope, obviously, of responsibility than what your generic help desk typically handles. So you've got your incidents, you've got the service requests, and you've got the communication with your customers. One of the other things that is also normally taken for granted in terms of having your customers make alternative plans when it comes to certain issues that might arise. It's the reason why if there's a planned outage in terms of that internet connectivity that we're talking about, whether they're upgrading your fiber line or fixing a distinctive issue that was experienced, it's important for you to understand that, okay, look, at a certain date and time, I might not have connectivity or might have reduction in quality as far as connectivity is concerned. It makes it easier for you to plan ahead or to plan obviously around that particular incident and issue to still get some kind of business continuity across the board. So incidents, service requests, and communication to your clients, they're looking at the broader scope of responsibility in that regard. And again, when you're looking at the whole concept of this evolution again, in that regard, it's important to realize that services within your company environments look at varying size as far as how or who is affected in that regard. So company size, the goals and the basic expectations, as far as configurations will go. Obviously, some institutions would provide informal or casual delivery of this particular technical support in certain aspects. So this is when you get what they call peer-to-peer support. That obviously has its own advantages and disadvantages in certain incidents as far as your specific setup there is concerned. So you'll find that help desk or service desk would literally enable certain institutions, organizations to look at maximization of their technical resources, right? And at the same time also ensure that individuals providing these particular services have the required skills. And I think it's very important in this regard because it enables incidents or issues to be resolved timeously and effectively, especially if you've got the right individuals that are skilled in that regard. The reason the whole issue of having peer-to-peer support problematic in certain instances is that it might come to a certain point where that informal solution or informal way of providing a solution becomes detrimental, where that particular initial incident or problem that was initially experienced has not been resolved appropriately or has not been resolved timeously or has only been temporarily resolved, and it's something that will still arise and cause productivity and efficiency issues a little later on. That's the reason why it's important to have the right individuals with the right skill set to resolve these issues, so that the tendency of or the propensity of these particular issues reoccurring is minimized, and it obviously positively affects productivity in that regard. So when you look at the actual evolution of the help desk to your distinctive service desk now, you'll find that, like we mentioned before, the term help desk was initially coined back in the late 70s there. And obviously, it was initially established or originally established to simply screen calls, right? So to screen calls and then literally forward accordingly to the appropriate departments dependent. But now you'll find that the service desk at large is the first and literally sometimes the only point of contact that customers have with a specific company or a company's IT department, right? So obviously there's that massive change in that regard. So you find that a lot of institutions or a lot of organizations or companies would obviously then consider this particular help desk as some kind of strategic corporate resource, right? Because of its constant interaction with the company's employees or customers. That's the reason why it's imperative in that regard. So there's been that change from your generic screening of calls to something that provides a central point of contact for any issues that might arise from your customers as well as employees at large. So if you go back to that peer-to-peer support I was talking about early on, it's effective when a coworker can help a person in the same department understand obviously how to use a product or a system for department-specific work. So that works within the same department in that regard. But obviously, the drawbacks we're mentioning early on, for instance, if you find that when a person literally asks a coworker for solving those complex incidences I was talking about early on, that neither one of them has the skills to resolve, they not only just waste time trying to resolve that issue, right? But at the same time, you might find that, again, like we were mentioning earlier on, they might actually make that particular issue worse. So it can range from the generic internet connectivity. It can also discuss the whole concept of you probably using a specific app, having problems with that particular app, trying to resolve it if you're not clued in that environment, waste time in terms of productivity, and at the same time also might make that particular issue a lot worse in that regard. That's the reason why it's important to have the appropriate individuals resolve it. So this evolution from your service desk environment, like I was just mentioning earlier on, initially used to just screen calls, right? And then you'll discover that as time went by, answer simple questions and resolve problems, all right? And then obviously take additional activities there. So if you look at page 12 in your prescribed textbook, you've got that particular information incorporated there. And then as the need grew with that evolution we were talking about earlier on, some institutions, organizations literally, instead of having their own internal platforms resolve these issues, they ended up outsourcing this particular help desk. And then again, a decade or so later, a lot of institutions recognize that something that is efficient in this regard can obviously positively affect the company's bottom line. That bottom line is it's obviously the engagement or the relationship that you've got with your customers or clientele, which literally links directly to the image of the business, which also links directly to client growth in essence, or at the end of the day, as far as your specific setups there are concerned. So with the whole concept of world-class environments, literally world-class just describes a company that has achieved and generically sustains high levels of customer satisfaction. That's what world-class is all about. But obviously, that is distinctly different to best in its class or best in class, which literally describes a company that is the finest in its industry or peer group. So one deals with customer satisfaction, the other one literally just identifies itself as the best in its specific environment or industry as far as configurations there would go. So typical examples there, if you're looking at a manufacturing company, would be literally considered excellent by its customers when compared only to other manufacturing companies. So for argument's sake, if you look at what we've got in typical environments out there, let's assume you also look at let's say Vodacom and MTN, right, in terms of quality of service as a typical example. You're comparing these two within the telecommunications space only, right? So it's Vodacom versus MTN in terms of either Vodacom being better than MTN or MTN being better than Vodacom in the telecommunications space. Right, so you're comparing it with another you're comparing Vodacom with another telecommunications institution. Same difference what applies with MTN, but you're not looking at it as in a holistic point of view in terms of MTN is a lot better when it comes to client interaction or when it comes to client consideration as compared to, for instance, Checkers. Or as compared to Pick and Pay, just for argument. These are already in different institutions or environments and altogether. So there's that difference between the world class and the best in class. When best in class within the same environment, world class just looks at overall customer satisfaction at large in terms of how a specific institution organization deals or works with its customers or clientele, if you want to look at it from a different point of view. So if you look at that particular graph there, you've got reactive and proactive. So remember, when you react to something, you only wait for it to happen and try and resolve it as it occurs. But when you're proactive, On the other hand, what you're looking at, you're expecting certain issues or problems to arise and are dealt with. These particular issues are dealt with prior, as far as your specific setup there is concerned. And then with the continuing with that whole concept of your evolution, you'll find that a lot of institutions adopted that document or the guideline we were talking about earlier on, and the actual concept of your generic service desk environment. And a lot of institutions now identify the actual benefits of certain technologies that you can use in providing the appropriate service desk environment. Before, it was just a quick question of you using your generic telephone line for calling in and so on. But now you had your generic remote control and diagnostic systems put in place as far as technology would go, your the internet space, and naturally generic incident management systems. So putting systems in place that would identify certain incidents or problems that are there, look at how to resolve them, look at the time that these particular incidents were resolved, and obviously if these particular incidents are occurring more often than not, then it's something that needs to be looked at in terms of the actual product or service being reconfigured or redesigned, whichever way you want to distinctively look at as far as configurations there is concerned. So when you look at the whole concept of if you go back to the whole issue of the outsourcing that we were mentioning earlier on, remember the whole concept of outsourcing help desks is looking at, it's just basically having services provided by an outside supplier, obviously instead of providing them in-house as far as a setup there is concerned. So when you look at it from a different perspective, you've got onshore outsourcing, which literally, especially when you're looking at it from a financial point of view, which looks at generically obtaining services from another country, from another company rather, within the same country. And then when it's nearshore outsourcing involving obtaining services from another company in a neighboring country. And then ultimately you've got offshore outsourcing, which looks at exporting of work from one country to another part of the world in that regard. So the proactive network monitoring and naturally your system and network administration tasks, like we mentioned before, with proactive, you're expecting that, okay, look, there could be a dip in network quality or in the quality of connection. There could be an issue in terms of bottlenecks that might arise with a lot of people or a lot of individuals connecting to this particular service. There could be literally a drop in overall quality at large. What can you actually put in place to avoid that happening? So this is you foreseeing certain issues that could be detrimental in terms of quality services being provided for, both from a product or a service point of view, and what measures you put in place to try and circumvent those issues at large. So when you look at the whole concept of empowering users to help themselves, this works within the same concept of obviously the self-help platforms we're discussing earlier on, and like I mentioned before, enables freeing up of time for analysts that will obviously need to develop skills that are needed to support technology innovations in that regard, because you don't have to waste too much time trying to assist your customers or clientele with issues that they can assist themselves with, just for argument's sake. So you need to provide a platform that enables for that enables you now as an analyst, for argument's sake, enough time to then obviously look at developing skills needed to support a distinctive technology innovation in that regard. So that's where your mobile cloud computing and the BYOD we're talking about earlier on comes in. Same difference would go with the desktop virtualization that we've discussed in your computer architecture module there. So obviously with that virtualization, if you want to look at it from a different point of view, again, separating PC desktop environment from an actual physical machine, obviously using client server model computing as far as your environments would go. Obviously with the client server setup, we'll be discussing that in network architecture to enable you to understand your network environments a little bit more in that regard. So you'll discover now that a lot of today's clientele obviously expect a variety of ways for support to take place. You're not limited to a specific or single channel, right? Very rarely do you find individuals wanting to call in now. Yes, like I said before, you'll still have individuals that will still need that human engagement, right? It happens everywhere across the board, but you want to avoid limitations in the way in which you can get your issues resolved. So in this regard, what we are mentioning is the fact that if you're looking at again, resolution of your network connectivity, for argument's sake, you want to avoid calling in, right? It's not just cumbersome for you to wait online for someone to assist. It also is an issue from an economic point of view as well, right? We don't want to end up, regardless of how much airtime we've got or how much connectivity we've got there, waste those resources trying to get something resolved where you can either use a web chat or where you can either use your self-service environment. So you want different channels that can be availed for in terms of resolution. More often than not, yes, the generic telephone call is normally when you need that immediate assistance in certain environments. But again, you also have your email and your web-based platforms that enable you to get resolution incorporated accordingly. Very rarely do we use voicemail now, but it's also part and parcel of those issues in that regard. So there needs to be a whole host of options that are provided for in terms of proper resolution in that regard. So if you can't make a phone call, you can use your chat. If you can't use your chat, you can pop a mail as typical examples of the options that are there. The more you limit these options, the more unattractive that particular product or service becomes if you look at it from a different point of view. So it's very important for you to make sure that at least your clientele or your customers have a range of channels that they can contact a specific service desk and get their issues distinctively resolved in that regard. So now with that same evolution from your help desk to your service desk environment, you have analysts who are then impelled, if you want to look at it from a different point of view, or compelled to look at developing skills that are distinctively needed to support a more complex environment. Obviously, look at being able to remotely handle these responsibilities as well, and also look at the whole concept of especially supporting a lot of users who would expect access to any information associated with their product or service at any particular time within any distinctive space as far as configurations would go, and obviously also become more skilled in the actual product and service at large. Such issues as security, such issues that would deal with connectivity related platforms, and also look at again, not working with the vendors or working with the providers of those particular services or products to literally identify certain problems and then naturally look at the root causes of incidents or problems that distinctively arise in that environment. So when you look at the whole concept of reactive service desks, like I was mentioning earlier on, waiting for certain issues to take place before you can obviously provide for a distinctive solution. They're not effective at all, because, or they're less effective. You want to look at it from a different point of view, because you're literally waiting on issues to take place. You don't have that forecast that we were talking about earlier on, that oversight to anticipate certain discrepancies and resolve them, or trying to have some kind of resolution that takes place before they actually occur at that point in time. So if you look at these particular service desks, obviously, like I was mentioning earlier on, policies and procedures put in place to proactively look at your business's strategic needs, look at obviously enhancing customer self-sufficiency, and prevent a multitude of incidents taking place in that regard. So the whole concept of that is obviously where a service desk should be, as far as proactive environments there is concerned. And then naturally, you find that a lot of opportunities are available for individuals that are obviously looking at jumping into this particular career, as far as your service desk environments there is concerned. And then I think in our last main section there, as far as today's setup there is concerned, is just then looking at the different components that make up a successful service desk. What are these, and why are they relevant, and how do they assist in that regard? And ultimately, one of the main things that you're looking at there is that whole people component we were talking about earlier on, that engagement that you've got with your clientele is of utmost importance. But again, you have to have the proper processes put in place to ensure that everything runs smoothly or accordingly. You have to have the right techno. It's not enough for you not to have the appropriate technology in this distinctive space. And actually in every particular industry, really, you still need to have the appropriate technology that makes resolution of issues a lot easier and smoother in that distinctive fashion. And obviously, you need to have access to information that assists in this regard. So the four critical components associated with a successful service desk, which we'll obviously be discussing in separate sessions and lectures, is going to be your people component, your processes, technology, and information in that regard. So very important for you to remember in terms of configuration in that regard. Ultimately, when you're looking at generically your people component, why it's most important is because more often than not, that's literally a first point of contact when it comes to your service desk environments in that regard. Because obviously this literally is directly related to what the company is all about. So your first point of contact is associated with your end image in terms of what the company is all about in that regard. So very important, first and most important component in terms of a successful service desk at large, as far as configurations they are concerned. So obviously your service desk level 1 or tier 1, initial point of contact, and the first point of contact has to be the most prepared, for lack of a better expression. Why? Because that would then ultimately literally reflect the actual image of the institution organization that you're looking at that particular point in time. So what are you looking at in this regard? Most of the content that you're already familiar with, just ensuring that the actual service desk team look at the whole issue of ethics, right? Basic standards that govern the way in which an individual conducts themselves, or a group of individuals conduct themselves. Again, in a one-liner, literally, ethics is about right and wrong, right? That's what ethics is all about. What is right and what is wrong in that regard. Ethical behavior obviously looks at what principles are reflected in that regard. Again, looking at the right and wrong environments. So ultimately, you should have policies put in place that will obviously detect or dictate rather your right and wrong behavior in that regard. So if you were ever literally in doubt or on the fence on something, you've got a guideline that is already there or a policy that is already there that enables you to know exactly what's happening in that regard. And then on the other hand, governance is how an organization controls its actions. Right, that's what governance is all about. It's how an organization literally controls its particular actions in that regard, as far as configurations would go. And then again, you obviously have policies and processes put in place to literally drive the right behavior across the board. And then again, still dwelling on your people. What we'll discuss in a bit more detail in the third learning unit there is understanding that these particular individuals that are part and parcel of the service desk space will need to have the appropriate business skills, appropriate technical skills, appropriate soft skills, which is obviously the way of engaging with your clientele. And then again, self-management skills in that regard. So it's something we'll discuss in a bit more detail a little later on. But these are the four skill sets that your particular individuals within your service desk are supposed to have in order for them to successfully deploy that distinctive service desk in its entirety. And then the second one with your processes, just generically looking at determining the actual, so basic collection of interrelated work activities that take a specific set of inputs and produce obviously a specific set of outputs. That's what a basic process is all about. You can also even directly link this to your computer architecture with the whole concept of data and information. Like we've mentioned before, data, raw facts and figures have to be processed first into a meaningful substance, which is information. Your data is input, and then obviously your information is output. That's what a basic process is all about. Just literally a collection of interrelated activities that obviously look at specific inputs and outputs in that regard. But on the other hand, a procedure now would be a step-by-step detailed instruction that describes how to perform a task within a distinctive process in that regard. So this is just determining what individuals would follow in relation to specific areas as far as your business environments there is concerned. So literally, you can talk about incident management, your request fulfillment, service level agreements would fall in this particular category as well, and then access management in that regard. So this would also be described in a bit more detail again in the fourth learning unit or the fourth chapter associated with generic processes at large. And then with the technology part, naturally, those incident management systems we were discussing earlier on, this is it's again very difficult for you to properly deploy a service desk or properly work with a service desk without the right technology put in place. Because how would you then monitor issues? How would you then try and better your environment? How would you then look at that proactive setup we were talking about earlier on? So basic incident management systems, your knowledge management systems, self-service systems, generic telephone systems, as well as your web systems put in place in that regard, as far as your setup would go. So remember, if you look at a basic call center environment, especially when you look at it from your telephone systems as well, you've got the inbound and the outbound platforms. How do those function within your service desk setup? where inbound specifically deals with incoming requests, incoming issues. Outbound is looking at contacting clientele and either following up on issues or either looking at basic engagement in that regard. So what you're looking at, again, that will be in your learning unit number 5 from a technological platform. Your incident management systems, like I was mentioning a couple of seconds ago, knowledge management, self-service, all the way down to your web-based systems as far as your setups there would go. So obviously on-job training is obviously important there when it comes to specific tools within a distinctive organization. There are certain proprietary architectures that are used within each individual organization that your particular setup would also be responsible for undertaking in that regard. And then the last one would be your information setup that is there, right? Again, this information enables you to literally work with configurations there. So people literally need information to do their work accordingly, all right? So without that information, makes it very difficult in that regard. But at the same time, management also needs information to control, measure, and obviously continuously improve these particular processes at a large there. All right. So those are your 4 distinctive processes there or components that are relevant when it comes to your proper service desk engagement as far as your distinctive environments there would go. The last thing that we want to take into consideration is obviously the customer service bottom line. So this is more or less what we were discussing right at the beginning, that your customer service literally involves ensuring that customers receive the maximum value for the actual products or services that they purchase, right? So they receive maximum value of the products or the services that they purchase. So that's what customer service is all about, ensuring that. And then obviously the value is the perceived worth, usefulness, or importance of a product or service to a customer. So the usefulness or importance or perceived worth is what your setup there is concerned. So high quality customer service is literally the goal of every customer oriented company or department. That's literally what you're distinctively looking at in that regard. Because remember, your customers' definitions of the value or importance of your particular product or service is literally influenced by their experience. All right, so every experience that they have is what influences the definition of the value, and this is important. This is why every contact to a customer or every contact the customer has with the service desk literally is an opportunity for the company to enhance that image. And remember, if you get a brilliant image, client growth is default in that regard. How many of us have chosen not to buy a product because of certain reviews, either the ones that we've read online or the ones that we've heard from colleagues, friends, or family? So it's very important to understand that these reviews or these particular encounters are positive, so that at least client growth is enhanced in that regard. All right, so that's what the bottom line there is all about, which we were discussing a couple of seconds ago. And it's important that satisfaction also reflects the difference between how a customer expects to be treated and how a customer perceives that they're supposed to be treated. So there's a massive issue in that regard. So customer satisfaction's main setup there reflects the difference between how a customer expects to be treated and how a customer perceives he or she was treated. That's what customer satisfaction is all about at the end of the day. All right. So that's literally that as far as your specific bottom line setup there is concerned. Naturally, these particular slides will be sent through on your VC Learn platform. I think a little later on today, we'll just plug them in on your VC Learn setup. We'll just create another folder there for your, for your slides that you can literally use in that regard. And you can go through this content. I think I'll upload this particular clip as well a little later on. All right, and then naturally, I think that does that. From a summary point of view, just obviously looking at the whole concept of what technology is all about at large, as far as your specific setup there is concerned, understanding the different components that are relevant in that regard. But I think that does that for us in this particular instance. Let's see if we can right, do we have any questions, contributions, or concerns here? I think mics are unmuted for those who want to speak. Feel free to also use the chat environment as well. Do we have any questions, contributions, and or concerns from anyone on the floor there? Questions, contributions, concerns, anyone? Questions, contributions, and or concerns from anyone? Okay, so that I think that that's that then for this introductory part. As far as your help desk there is concerned, like I mentioned a couple of seconds back, I'll upload the slides we just used a little later on, and as well as this recorded clip should you need to go through this particular content as well later on the YouTube channel. But otherwise, if we don't have any questions, contributions, and concerns from anyone, I think we should be good. Let's take a bit of a breather, and then we'll convene for our network architecture a little later on. All right, then. See you in a bit.